The last talk began with the story of Derek, whose basically attitude is to go down the supermarket of life and with his spiritual shopping cart and pick out what looks good. And then we went on from there. And of course, what Denny said was, isn't that, it sounded just appallingly casual, which of course in Derek's case it is. On the other hand, aren't we all in something like that situation? That there are many spiritual offerings, many religions, many other kind of spiritual paths, spiritual techniques, and we have to make some decision about them. And the most, what often seems to people like the safe choice is to, well, go with one of the name brands, right? You know, I mean, where they've got it organized, you got a 1,000-year, multi-thousand-year history with the wisest and people of spiritual masters and everything. And they've got canonical text in whatever tradition, a tradition of interpreting those texts, canonical figures, kind of iconic figures that are revered for their insight or exemplification of the right kind of way to live. And the problem with that is it's not that safe, because how do you this is why, the first question last time, this question about discernment, about criteria. What are the criteria, which I kind of translate in the question about discernment? There's what I call the criteriological fallacy. Knowledge does not all normally proceed by having criteria up front. You drink a lot of wine before you come up with criteria for a good Chablis, right? It's a kind of retrospective summation, and which, unless you're dealing with chemistry and litmus tests or something, isn't that definitive. The criteria you come up with are not, you're always exploring it. They're just sort of markers. And that's how most life is. Judgments, think of your moral judgments, unless you're overly impressed with philosophy, you don't just go zap the categorical imperative onto everything, or the principle of utility, let me bring out my calculator. That's crude. And in fact, you've asked, how do people come up with categorical imperative and principle of utility? It's by actually having made moral judgments and having been struck that a lot of correct moral judgments conform to something like the categorical imperative. A lot of wrong behavior is the attempt to count oneself an exception. I steal, but of course I don't want other people to steal or to steal from me. I lie. I don't want them to lie for me. I'm parasitic on their truth-telling. And so it's just something like that, or isn't it human happiness that counts? And so you start wanting to bring out the calculator and say, calculate. But those are always tested against the judgments that are more certain than the principles. So you have to be very careful about going after criteria. What you really need, and this is to cultivate judgment. And in the spiritual area, that's what one usually means by spiritual discernment. How do you tell? To put it in Jean Gerson's language, true coins from counterfeit. Just, how do you tell? And it's not easy. So picking the brand, in a way, is you're saying, I'll let, they have an impressive history, and there's something about them, whoa, I admire, or maybe it's what I was born into, so I'm going to, you might say, delegate my discernment to them. And in the cognitive area of life, that's actually a reasonable thing to do. I delegate my understanding of physics to physicists I read, and that's a reasonable thing for me to do. How would I check up on them ordinarily? So Michael Polanyi has written about this in Science, Faith, and Society, that all scientists, and any given scientist knows this much and relies on the truthfulness of colleagues and their results to, do his or her own work in an ongoing enterprise. So there's nothing exactly wrong with delegating it. However, you do have to realize the decision you're making. It's like handing your life over to someone else. And you think, well, aren't they reliable? Well, how do we know they're reliable? When we look at I was talking about this in the AAR, when you look at their literature, I'm mainly familiar with the Christian literature on spiritual discernment, it always starts with their own creed. You know, if you think you have a kind of perception that you should behave in a certain way or believe a certain way, well, the number one criterion is, does it agree with us? You know, does it agree with the Vatican or with Luther or with Calvin or with whomever it may be? And it works a little differently, as I understand. I've asked I asked Jeffrey Long, how do you do this in the Hindu tradition? For example, well, it's your guru, keeps you on track. But then everybody knows gurus can abuse their power, can go bad. So even though in one funny way you've got to hand yourself over to your guru, in another way, wait, you can't 100% do that. And it seems that every attempt to hand off your own responsibility for your spiritual journey has this kind of risk that, well, they can be wrong, they can go wrong. How do they know? And if you look at the sort of structure of a religion, it seems so great because I have a Southern Baptist minister friend. He said, I live by the Bible. Well, okay, but how did the Bible come about? And how do you know they're competing scriptures, and they're even competing books of the Bible. You know, the J group or something they decided that Luke or something wasn't any good, and I can't remember which one should probably be thrown out, and the Gospel of Thomas should be included. And you know, and of course you go back to the early church, they had different lists floating around for about 100 years or so before those kind of came into a single alignment. So how did they know? You can press it back. How did Paul know to trust his experience rather than thinking, gee, I had bad sunstroke, you wouldn't believe, you know, the hallucinations I had, but instead Paul makes the other judgment that Jesus spoke to me and said what he said. And even within a religion, theology requires spiritual discernment. It's not just intellectual problem solving. You're trying to hone in on something true that's beyond just your own idea system. And that requires spiritual discernment as well as intellectual acuity and, of course, certain learning and so forth of the tradition you're working within. So theology also, how do you choose if you're already committed to be a Christian, how do you choose this denomination over that? If you decide to be a Hindu, how do you choose this god or goddess over that one, or this avenue to the divine? It's a tradition that allows a lot of pluralism, but I guess my point is the challenge of discernment is inescapable. You can hand it over, but then at great risk. And you've got to make some judgment yourself why you chose that way. Hi, good to see you.
Pardon my lateness. I went to a buddy.
No, here, join us right in. Here's some excerpts from the talk I gave in October. So if you missed that or want a refresher, that's about a page and a half of key excerpts. Well, back to Derek, who's our guy in the spiritual supermarket. He could pick one religion, kind of prefix, you just buy the whole menu and they bring it all out. Or he can go a la carte and pick and choose what beliefs to accept, what practices to accept. And that sounds high risk, but if you look at practice, I would say that's what most Americans do. I've got Catholic friends, they do not believe everything the Vatican tells them, infallibility or not. If they disagree with one of the points, they say, well, I believe the rest, but I don't believe that. Or sometimes even the word I believe seems to be a little bit in scare quotes, as if, well, I'm willing to go along with that. With this or that doctrine, I have no objection, but on these others, I do have an objection. I go my own way. So people within a tradition, in a kind of American pluralistic context, tend to do that. And I'm told by people who study this sort of thing that around the world, in kind of urban, especially kind of educated urban people, tend to be very much the same way, that they may have moved to Mumbai from some village, and in the village, they may have been very entrenched with a very specific religious tradition, understanding, set of practices, and so forth. They move to Mumbai, encounter different views, become much better educated about the options in the world, and who knows what else, just have a different set of personal experiences. And they start becoming, well, Mumbai is more pluralistic than the village they came from, and part of what it was Christopher Denny who introduced the case of Derek from his own classroom experience, kind of points out that, in a way, this is what all of our religions are. They all evolve. They came about. You can think the Bible plopped down one day, but it didn't quite. And the creeds emerged later and were fought over and modified and so on. So it's wrong to put up the myth of the great religions as though they're well, they have beautiful cathedrals, but intellectually they're not quite that planted and firm as the cathedrals or the other monumental architectures look. And of course, here's where we start getting where push comes to shove, because one way or another, you got one spiritual life to live the way you got one life to live in your romantic life, in your professional life, in every other part of your life, and leaving out reincarnation. But anyway, you're in this life, you're living it, you've got to make choices, and it's urgent to you to choose what's valid rather than invalid. What's up rather than down, what's going to move you forward rather than what's going to distort you. And then the question, and I also, in my own personal views, I wouldn't say this is an automatic definition of TWW, which mainly just says don't limit your understanding of the divine or the ultimate just to your confession, and not if you want to know the fullest story possible. Don't limit it in that way. So Theology Without Walls mainly just starts with one negative thing, and then once you decide, okay, now we're going to try to take in more understanding of the ultimate reality than just what is in our tradition, then you've got a lot of work to do and a lot of discovery, and because this is somewhat new as a kind of self-conceived enterprise, we don't quite know how people are going to come out, and I've made a point of not overly defining it at the beginning, because there are a lot of brilliant people out here who are spiritually deep, and let's see what they all come up with. And in the course you two just took, or just finished, you're reading a lot of what, in a rather same spirit, a lot of the people came up with, what Panikar or someone like that came up with. I take it that those are all options. And what we need to do is live them out and think them through and see which ones stand up well. There's some that look promising 50 years ago that don't look so good today, that have not held up to scrutiny so well. And in my own view, that I was going to say, I don't take to be definitional of TWW, but my own view is that the decision is, you might say, radically personal. And I don't mean personal in the sense of subjective or arbitrary, any more than which medicine you should take is subjective or arbitrary, but it is personal. You know, each person, my wife has a condition which starts with the horrible word what is it? Idiographic or
Peripheral.
no, the peripheral.
Idiopathic.
But idiopathic is the word I'm looking for. The horrible word idiopathic, which means we do not know what it is. It doesn't fit this disease, this malady, that malady. It's just your body doing this. And for her condition, about a third of the people are idiopathic, and idiopathic isn't a category, it's an array of different people. Well, the spiritual life is idiopathic, except it's not pathic. Well, what's the word we want if we wanted to make it healthy? It's medicinal, let's say. And that the task of discernment isn't just which big picture is right, or even, you know, there are various spiritual practices designed for spiritual growth, to move you forward or deeper, whatever metaphor seems apt. And you can try them. That's an advantage of those. You see, though you still have to have the discernment to see, am I flaking out, or am I actually growing and becoming deeper, more insightful, more integrated, and things like that. But there's also the question of your life as a kind of spiritual drama. And what is your role in that drama? What is your future? What is your mission? What is your calling? When I found out that, you know, I started in all this back when I was just a secular philosopher and was learned that every minister or priest, and I don't know if there's something like this in the Eastern tradition, but you're supposed to have a calling, not just a job description, not, you know, a little, I remember in high school they gave us career things you'd be good at, this kind of thing. It's not just that. It's supposed to be a calling that goes beyond that. That God or the ultimate or whatever is tapped you for this assignment. And so I've started asking people, and some have, you know, kind of dramatic stories to tell. Father Clooney, whom I asked, said, well, it was like a finger pointing at him, like tapping him in the chest, you know. And I asked this Southern Baptist minister I was talking about, a friend of ours, lives in our town, and he said, well, God laid a burden on my heart. And I didn't probe, well, how did you know that burden? But, you know, talk about a challenge of spiritual discernment, there is one. Is that his ego? Is that something else? Or is this the real deal? I think the main clue is we always want a litmus test, a single principle, single rule. No actual human inquiry does that. Even on science, which is the most, I started to say rigidified, but that's not quite what I mean, kind of highly organized, articulate, explicit in how it does its business, and I'm thinking especially of physics. Even there, you look at the literature and philosophy of science, there are no criteria for what makes a good scientific theory. There's no criteria for what makes a hypothesis worth investigating. And you find people, like Polanyi, who was a very prominent chemist, saying you need, talking about connoisseurship. You know, you sort of develop a sense of what lines are going to be fruitful, and you pursue them. It's not infallible, but that's your best way to go, is to follow your instinct, and it's an educated instinct from scientific practice. But we're really in the realm that I find it most useful to think of as judgment. And when you're in the realm of, and that's why I was mentioning ethical judgment. You're in the realm of judgment. Judgments are particular. They have to do with you and your situation. That's true of practical judgments. It's true of moral judgments. When you ask, should I tell this person such and such, an uncomfortable truth as I see it? Should I share this with my friend? Well, I noticed I said my friend. It depends on, well, who are you? What is this other person to you? Are you just butting in? Or is it in some way your responsibility to let this person know this uncomfortable thing you happen to know, to reveal a secret or something? All of these particularities go into judgment. And what I have found in a way, the literature on spiritual discernment tends to support, in its own way, the tradition, it's kind of new, called virtue epistemology, where it just seems over and over the key criterion. I think in different traditions, I use the bad word criteria, but I think different traditions would discuss this in ways that were at least analogous, that the way I think of it just in my own life is you got to get the clutter out of the way. You've got to make sure this is a perception, a judgment, a course of action that proceeds from you in your most centered, integrated way, where you're not being distracted, your own desires aren't sweeping you away, your own cynicism isn't holding you back. The kind of virtues, it's called virtue epistemology because the virtues are always a kind of middling between extremes. And you can be too gullible so that every crazy thing comes along. You accept, wow, that sounds good. Or just you hear a speaker who's sort of charismatic and sweeps you away. And oh, so there you go over the cliff. That's a mistake. You need to come back to your centered. At the same time, to sort of either just cynically reject everything that seems to you like a spiritual insight, every direction that you feel called to, saying, well, I don't really know, to reject, if you look at Jung's category of synchronicities that occur in your environment, to say it's of everything, it's a coincidence, even when it's begging for the dots to be connected in a way that tells you something. And so to be overly cynical, doubtful, skeptical is also a mistake. And so, and the key does seem to be a kind of spiritual growth such that your own emotions aren't sweeping your way, your ego isn't, your fears aren't. You can even have too little ego so that you think, oh, well, I'm not good enough or I'm not up to it. You can be too self-critical. That's the area of well, that's just kind of the key. That's sort of how you know you're proceeding in the right way. Does this fit your experience, what I'm saying?
Yes.
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Your topic, Theology Without Walls.
Yes.
Beyond pluralism.
Yes.
Is, I think, what I am doing.
That's what you're doing. Okay. Well, and I'm so pleased. It's hard to talk to the people over 60 about this, even the ones who have a pluralistic impulse, because theology to them means the articulation of my tradition. And then it's a labor to somehow stretch it over to something else. Can you give an instance when, on this question of discernment, where you puzzled and came to a conclusion after puzzling, or an action or whatever, an attitude, and what made you feel you're on the right track?
Oh, I'm doing the process study.
Yes.
Concept relational.
Yes.
Theology.
Yes.
For example, my Ph.D. thesis is a relational theological understanding on creation in trialogue among Buddhist, Christianity, natural science, and Buddhism.
Yes, yes. And why that? This is similar to what I was saying to you. Yeah, we were talking about, one of these things strikes you. Well, that is already the activity of discernment taking place. Yeah. And because there are a million things you could study, right? You're drawn to this. It might just start with the first thing you said, relational. Why relational?
Because there is a conflict between Christian and Buddhist.
Okay.
Buddhist, the majority. I come from Burma, Myanmar.
Yeah.
Maybe you know about the situation of our country.
Well, I'm afraid.
The conflicts between the majority Theravada Buddhist, Christian, and then Muslim. Recently, the Muslim.
Yes. And so relational issues
Yeah.
are crucial. Yeah. Could I ask you, Andrew?
We are trying to do.
Yes.
Just a kind of an initial point that we start doing kind of academic level interfaith dialogue between my institute
Yes.
and Theravada. No, the school is International Theravada Buddhist Missionary University. So that is, we have to strengthen that. And my institute is leading institute to construct kinds of relational in the level of academic dialogue. So that matter is what I come here.
Yes. Well, actually, another important part of these, I was talking about how these, it's a matter of judgment. Judgments are particular. They're in particular situations. And what you find in life is different people, I like John Dewey's phrase, have different problematic situations. Thought doesn't occur in a vacuum or in a purely abstract, so you've got a big empty blackboard, let's just start writing things on it. It occurs in a human situation where you're dealing with something. He likes to talk about problems. You're dealing with a certain problem in your situation. You've described, and that kind of defines then often the orientation of your thinking. You have a problem in your country that has religious implications.
Religious,
yes.
kinds of religious, political, social.
Yeah, all of those.
Everything. Complex conflict.
Yes, complex. And so you're trying to think through how you can constructively address that problematic situation. For somebody else, the problematic situation might not be economic, political, etc., or between different religions. It might be being the child of an alcoholic and having had a crummy childhood, and now how they're going to right themselves, because that leaves a person with distortions and disruptions and dysfunctions, how to right themselves and understand coping with that beginning and getting their spiritual sensors, tuned up so that they can live a meaningful, purposeful life that's related to truth. And that's a very different kind of problematic situation. Can I ask you, Andrew, the same question? Can you think of particular issues where you kind of wondered about your own discernment and came to a conclusion, made a decision?
Yeah, well, I think in my own personal life that what's interesting is that there are things which, like experiences where I thought, oh, that was an experience of God, or that was, that then years later, as my theology changed, my philosophy changed, my sort of interpretation of those experiences also changed.
Yes.
To which I thought, was it really God?
Maybe
not. I don't know. Maybe.
Or God in what sense?
Yeah, it's like maybe it's just that spaghetti I had that night.
Right.
But I think what's interesting is this notion that you're talking about of contextualization, right? So we all have our particular experiences, and it's within that particularity that we sort of are having these spiritual encounters.
Yes.
And doing our theology in our particularity. But it's also always framed in another sense of sort of in shared experience, a shared context.
Yes.
That our two contexts may be different, but they're not so wholly different that we can't relate to one another.
Right.
And it's that sort of balance and interplay between sort of the universal and the particular, the continuity and the change, that I find very interesting, where I think Theology Without Walls can provide a method of doing theology that transcends the particularity, but also that depends on it. Does that make sense?
Sure. I sometimes think of it as somebody was saying they didn't like, they thought this made them not like TWW, but it's kind of these universals. It was a feminist theologian. These universals across traditions, and there are some thinkers, you read them in your course, who take that approach. They're trying to come up with one big picture and characterize it in some way or other. And I said, but I rather like to think of particularities across traditions, because we all live under the dome of heaven, let's say. Sure. We live in one world. These contexts are not different worlds, after all. They're in one world.
Right.
But that's not quite the same. So you take them into account. That's not the same as necessarily having to come up with a single generalization across all the traditions.
Right. But so I mean, for example, to say,
yeah.
That Esther and I have different bodies.
Yes.
That our bodies experience things differently. And,
yes.
She didn't feel that.
Right.
But
she might.
She's very sensitive.
She's worried that I'm going to slap her now.
Yeah.
But that we both experience things as embodied.
Yes.
Significant as a source of overlap for our experience, which allows for there to be an interplay through dialogue.
Yes.
So I'm just thinking in terms of, so when you use the example, right, of picking things off the menu, you could either be sort of a la carte, or you can choose a standard option. But then it occurs to me that, well, how did these things end up on the menu in the first place?
Yes.
Is there room for us to create new options that don't exist on menus?
Yes.
To put things in fresh combinations that sort of don't. It's not just a matter of picking and choosing a single tradition or a single answer, or even a standard one, but that it's a sort of the inquisitive process.
Yes.
Is the emphasis. So not sort of universal answers, but you can talk about universal questions.
Well, there may be.
I mean, not saying there are or are not.
Right, but there might well be.
You're concerned about some people want to talk about sort of universal answers to things, and that's what we should be looking for, and others, we want to focus on particular answers. That's true for you. But if the focus is not on the answers, but on the questions, it's a reorientation.
Right.
That doesn't require us to come down on one side or another. So the TWW is not one or the other, it's both and neither at the same time.
Yeah, and all of that needs to be explored. It all needs to be explored.
But I guess what I'm suggesting is that there is room for exploration.
Yes.
And that it's not, we don't have to be concerned about the predetermined criteria of what Theology Without Walls has to be.
Or just religion A, B, C, and D, the established brands. That's the kind of the menu. These established things on the menu. It's a real limitation. It's one reason I tend to distinguish TWW from comparative theology.
Right.
For one thing, TWW has nothing to do per se with comparison. We're not trying to compare A with B, though most studies in comparative theology do exactly that. And moreover, it privileges implicitly, given the way it's done, privileges the category of religion. So it's a thinker usually from religion A and a thinker from religion B, from that big tradition, as if they were monolithic. But back to Andrew's point, what about other options? Why can't we, at the last meeting, we had a panel on love, human and divine. And that's not tradition A, tradition B, tradition C. We're talking about the phenomenon of love, and the phenomenon of love in its human dimension, and it's with regard to the ultimate, and how one relates those, and different ones taking different avenues of that. And there may be whole new options out there. John Thetomenal, I used in the earlier talk, I mentioned his idea of religions as spice cabinets. And he points out, in fact, this is true, often you have a single set of spices, but you assemble them one way for Italian dishes, a different way for Indian dishes, so you can make a choice. But kind of picking up on Andrew's point, but why just think you only have Italian dishes and Indian dishes? You might create a cuisine that nobody has conceived of before by rearranging these spices or spiritual insights. You take these spiritual insights wherever they come and then put them together in the way you find most meaningful. And it may or may not resemble any current tradition, or even a fusion of two traditions, or some kind of compromise between them. and it might, well, it just might create a completely new opening, might not be a religion at all that you're trying to achieve. Oh, and I was going to say it might not be limited to explicitly religious materials. You get a room full of scholars, theologians and scholars in religious studies. They're going to think, if they talk about love, of what the religious traditions tell. But that's not the only source of information about love. That's not even close to the only, there's psychology, there's literature, there's also our lives. When John Theology in his book says, having looked at Shankara, he likes Shankara because you get closer to God, but he wants more room for loving desire. And I assume this comes out of something in John Theology's life. I've not asked him this question, but how would you decide whether it's important to have loving desire as a positive in your theology? Well, I think it almost surely has something to do with the sense of your own life and what it's about. That's a speculation about him, but I think a general point about how one comes to these things. Could I go around and just pursue this question a little more, John?
If I had an experience like this, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So, I mean, I was raised Catholic.
Okay.
And probably I had a very naive understanding of Catholicism at the time.
As everybody does, right?
And it was very transcendent for me.
Yeah.
And that's where I got interested in Buddhism, because it was very human-oriented, at least my understanding, right? Going through the psychological components of thought, how we derive our beliefs and so forth.
Yes.
And that got me interested back into religion after going through an atheistic stage, right?
Yes. Yes.
And so I see where it draws us in, right? Given my context, the notion of transcendence wasn't doing it for me. And now in my adult naive stage, right?
Yes, yes. Your advanced naivete.
Advanced naive, yeah. I'm drawn back into this conversation, and I love what you're saying. And it's something Andrew and I hash out a lot, and we're trying to figure out the greater role this plays within probably religious believers themselves.
Yeah.
And this is where the question lies for me, right? It almost seems like religion without belief, if it's a spice cabinet as such, right?
Yes, it's
like these are the issues that
it's an important question to raise. What's the role of belief?
Yeah.
Or if any,
right.
Or what? How does it need to be defined here?
And perhaps religion just becoming so enamored with these propositions, right? These
yes,
claims.
Yes.
I mean, maybe we've done it wrong from the beginning, but now we're trapped in
kind of creeds and isms.
Maybe it was always supposed to be a type of spice racket, right?
Yeah.
Spice rack.
No, that's a...
So it's trying to break free of this. So I'm trying to think, where is this? It's not a religion among religions. It's more of like a philosophy that freely engages all the spiritual traditions, wisdom traditions, which I love. But I'm trying to think how to respond to those religious believers.
Yeah, yeah.
And then where this fits in with pluralism.
Yes.
Because it's not necessarily pluralism either.
No.
Because Clooney does, I guess he would call himself somewhat of a pluralist, right? But he wouldn't go away from his Christian faith.
Yeah, he always comes back to that.
He'd always come back.
Yeah.
In this, it's not really coming out or going back.
Right.
It's just this becoming of embodied experiences.
In the quest for meaning.
In the quest.
Yeah, it's much more experiential and individual, and I never went back to explain the beyond pluralism in the title, but pluralism is the thesis about the relation of religions.
Right.
Right?
This is beyond.
Each one claims to be true, and we're leaving that category. It's not that it doesn't exist in the world. It's useful certainly for textbooks, for example, but it's not very true to reality. For openers, every religion is a kind of syncretism, and every religion is enormously diverse, and so you can be a monotheist in Hinduism if you want to, or in a Western tradition, or you can have something like Brahman in a Western tradition, and all kinds of other funny things, you might say, in one. What I was interested in, John, was at the very beginning of your narrative. You were Catholic.
Yep.
the naive understanding. It was strong on transcendence. And what I didn't understand is what made you abandon that? I mean, you then went, I don't know if atheism came first or Buddhism came first.
Atheism, then Buddhism.
Buddhism was
more secular, right? That's how it's sold to a lot.
Yeah, you don't have the God, you don't have the creed.
Yeah, and then back to Catholicism, through Buddhism, through the more mystical, heretical thinkers of the tradition.
Okay. Meister Eckhart comes back,
Exactly.
right?
That's my dissertation.
Okay.
Eckhart in Buddhism. So,
but that's... So you threw away the first because... At the time, don't think why you would now, how you justify it now.
So
at the time, what struck you as wrong with this?
It seemed very theocentric, as if my personhood was, just stay in line.
Oh, to stay in line.
Yeah. My personhood was relegated for the greatness of this theocentric ideas that we have. Where my experience is somewhat relegated, right? How I feel, like, yeah, okay, you might feel that, but just stay in line. Hold to these beliefs, do these rituals.
Yeah. And you confess, you go to confession.
Right.
And
I think that's where Theology Without Walls is so interesting, or even comparative theology to me. It's just...
Sure. It's very rich.
Yeah. Just expansion of understanding that your experiences do have a place within this wider whole, and it's okay if you dabble.
Yes.
To kind of fill these needs that you may feel as if it's lacking.
Yes.
But I mean, now that when I look at the Christian tradition, the Catholic tradition, I mean, the stuff that I was lacking, that I thought I was lacking, like, it's there.
Yes.
But I just, initially, this very naive understanding of Catholicism, of course, given the background of a secular society in which we live, that kind of drove that as well.
Yes.
But when you actually do investigate it, you find what you were looking for.
Yeah,
then you
the
can't
riches
go back.
are there. Yes.
I can't go back to Catholicism prior to this.
Yeah.
Because now it's been informed through the very eminent understanding of Buddhist thought and Yeah.
So that's the journey. That's just a good example of the journey.
Listening to what you're saying, I wrote, we are all micro-traditions.
Yes, micro-traditions. That's a good phrase. You're kind of constructing your own micro-tradition as you go along.
Right.
Because it's not the same now as it was 5 years ago, and it will be somewhat different.
Just as these macro ones continue to form and kind of, they have their blurring lines on the side. Yes, I affiliate, I don't affiliate.
Yes.
But we're these micro-traditions of becoming just as they became, even though we try to hold them in this pure, abstract, timeless essence.
Yeah.
How interesting.
Here's a question related to that. Would you say that Theology Without Walls, does it have room for religious belonging in the traditional sense? As long as it doesn't have restrictions where you have to, that you can't explore beyond those walls?
Yeah, I think, how are we on time?
We're good, yeah.
I mean, are we halfway through?
Yeah, we have about a half hour left.
A half hour left. Well, maybe I did want to hear these other stories. On the other hand, this is the second, really opens the second topic. Why don't I quickly hear your story, Rob, and your story, and just if you come up, have something you can identify.
My story's somewhat similar. Raised Catholic.
Okay.
Catholic, very Roman Catholic.
Very Roman.
I was actually a diocesan seminarian.
Oh, wow.
So I was studying for the priesthood.
Yes.
And actually had the Jesuits try to rope me in when I was at Gonzaga. Definitely thought about it. Still very appealing in many respects.
Yes.
But I think it kind of ties into Andrew's question about religious identity, and trying to wrestle with that, I think, is probably my own narrative, in as much as not only I was actually started reading within a very largely Protestant community. I mean, I grew up in rural Pennsylvania, so I was one of maybe a dozen Catholics at my high school, including faculty and staff. So it was mostly my family, a couple other families, and then a handful of employees at the school who were Catholic out of maybe 700 other people.
Yeah. Amazing.
Mostly Methodists, a lot of United Methodists, Baptists, Lutherans. So I kind of grew up in that milieu, as well as always being fascinated by the natural sciences.
Yeah.
So I grew up reading Teilhard, Carl Sagan, others along those lines. Kind of have tried to find, my own story is trying to find a balance between my love of the natural world.
Yeah.
And probably, I think the way I phrased it within the paper that I wrote for the class that Esther and I had, that we just wrapped up, I said, as much as I really struggled with and have rejected some of what the Catholic Church has taught, it's because of my love of the church that I do so, as well as my love for the natural world. That, I mean, an example would be coming from the East Coast to start here at Claremont just this past August. I would describe my experience at stopping and camping out at the Grand Canyon as a very religious experience.
Yes.
So I oftentimes identify as a religious naturalist now.
Yes.
But I always qualify it by saying it's somewhat theistic. Whereas most religious naturalists are agnostics or atheists.
Yes. Yes.
And I think
so that's an interesting difference, and would be worth exploring why that is natural to you. Also, we're going to move to the second topic in a moment, but maybe we can come back to your experience of loving the church.
Oh, yeah.
Strikes me as a very striking phrase, and we'll come back to that in a minute in the context of the question. And I'm sorry, I didn't quite get your name.
Yeah, my name is Leron. I'm
Luan?
second Leron. Lerron.
What is it?
Lerron.
Lerron.
Yes.
Leron.
I am a second year Ph.D. in practical theology, which is what drew me to this seminar. I actually did my master's thesis on the spiritual but not religious.
Okay.
So that's what drew me.
Good. So you know exactly the guy Derek we're talking about, who's got his shopping cart, and doesn't know what to pick.
Right. Linda Mercadet was another author that came.
Yes. Linda
Mercadet.
Yeah.
I think that's how you pronounce it.
She was at our TWW sessions in AAR.
Okay.
I didn't give a talk, but she was lively in the discussion.
Okay.
And I want to read her book. I've not read her book.
I didn't read
having met
the
her,
thing either.
I want to go read it because it sounds really interesting. I mean, this is the coming phenomenon.
Yes.
Right?
This is exactly what I did my thesis on.
This is the coming.
The numbers bear it out. It's not big yet. It's about maybe somewhere in the 20% of people who do not identify.
But it's growing if you chart it year to year.
Oh, yeah.
And it differs across generations too. Definitely, especially I think millennials tend, because I wrote a similar paper on the future of religion where I talked about the nuns, and especially among millennials, younger millennials in particular. I think it's up into the around 34, 35% last, I think according to the 2015 Pew research.